The sky over the Gulf Coast looks normal until something blocks the sun. At first, no one understands what they're seeing. It's too big to be a bird, too silent to be a plane. A fisherman squints up from his boat, and then it moves, not flapping, not struggling, gliding, smooth, controlled, effortless. The wings stretch wider than anything that should exist, nearly 20 feet across, long, narrow, built to stay in the air without trying. It circles once, then again, like it's studying something below, or someone. For a moment, everything feels wrong, because whatever this is, it knows exactly what it's doing. Then it drops, not fast, not chaotic, precise. The water explodes upward in a sudden burst of white. Gone. 1 second, 2. Then it rises again. Something thrashes in its jaws. A fish almost as long as a man's arm. Heavy. Still fighting. But it doesn't matter because the creature never lands. It doesn't need to. It climbs back into the sky, adjusting mid-air with small, almost invisible movements. Perfect control over something that should be impossible. And just like that, it disappears, leaving behind nothing but ripples. And a question that shouldn't exist. Because whatever just flew over the Gulf Coast isn't supposed to be alive. It hasn't existed for over 65 million years. And yet, it flies like it never left. For most people, what they just saw doesn't make sense. Because creatures like that aren't supposed to exist anymore. When people think of pterosaurs, they imagine something awkward, slow, clumsy, half bird, half reptile, a failed version of flight that disappeared with the dinosaurs. But that image? It's completely wrong. What flew over the Gulf Coast wasn't a bird. It wasn't even a dinosaur. It belonged to something else entirely, a different branch of life that solved flight in its own way, and may have done it better than anything alive today. Pteranodon wasn't struggling to stay in the air. It was built for it. Every part of its body points to one thing: efficiency. Its bones were hollow but reinforced from the inside. Light enough to stay airborne for hours, strong enough to handle the stress of flight. Its wings weren't covered in feathers. They were stretched membranes of skin and muscle, anchored to a single, elongated finger that acted like a living support beam. Long, narrow, engineered for glide. This wasn't something that flapped constantly to survive. It didn't have to. It rode the air. Using invisible currents, thermals rising from warm surfaces, winds moving along the ocean, it could stay in the sky for miles without wasting energy. Modern aircraft still rely on the same principles. But this was natural, and more importantly, it worked. For millions of years, Pteranodon dominated coastlines, not by speed, not by strength, but by understanding something most animals never could: how to let the air do the work. So if something like that is flying today, the question isn't whether it can survive, it's whether anything else up there can compete with it. To understand how something like this stays in the sky, don't think about biology. Think about what you just saw. That moment when it wasn't flapping, wasn't struggling, just hanging there, like the air itself was holding it up. That's not an illusion. That's the system. Those wings nearly 20 feet across aren't just big. They're shaped to disappear into the wind. Long, narrow, the kind of shape you see on gliders, machines designed to stay airborne as long as possible without power. Except this isn't a machine, it's alive. As it moves forward, air flows over the surface of those wings, faster on top, slower underneath, and that difference pulls it upward, not in bursts, not in effort, but continuously. As long as it keeps moving, the sky keeps lifting it. That's why it doesn't need to flap. Because it's not fighting gravity, it's working with it. And then there's the launch. You'd expect something that size to struggle getting off the ground, to run, to build speed. It doesn't. Instead, it explodes upward, all four limbs pushing at once. A sudden, violent burst of force, like a spring releasing. One moment it's grounded, the next, it's already airborne. And once it's up there, everything changes. It locks into a glide. Rising columns of warm air, thermals, carry it higher. Ocean winds push it forward. It adjusts constantly, but barely. Tiny movements, almost invisible. Every correction costs almost nothing. Even its head matters. That long crest trailing behind, it's not decoration. It balances the entire body in flight, keeping it stable, preventing wasted motion. Because at this scale, efficiency is survival. Every gram of weight, every degree of angle, every shift in air, all of it feeds into one purpose: stay in the sky. Stay there longer than anything else. Because once it's up there, it doesn't just exist. It owns that space. It doesn't slow down. It doesn't circle endlessly. When Pteranodon hunts, it commits. Low over the water, just a few feet above the surface, it glides in silence. No splash, no warning. From above, the ocean looks calm, but it isn't. Beneath the surface, something moves. A flicker, a flash of silver, a school of fish, tightly packed, shifting as one. That's all it needs. It adjusts, barely. A slight tilt of the wing, a change in angle, then it drops. Not a dive like a hawk. No explosive acceleration, just a smooth, controlled descent, perfectly timed. The beak cuts into the water, clean, precise. No wasted motion. For a fraction of a second, everything disappears beneath the surface. Then it's already rising again, still moving forward, never stopping. Something thrashes in its jaws, heavy, slippery, alive. But there's no struggle, because the beak isn't built to fight. It's built to take, long, narrow, toothless, no tearing, no chewing, just a perfect shape for slipping through water and pulling something out. The fish slides inward. No resistance, no delay. By the time it clears the surface, the hunt is already over, and it never had to land. That's the difference. Landing would slow it down, trap it on the surface, force it to waste energy getting airborne again. So it doesn't. Everything happens in motion: catch, lift, swallow, and then it's already scanning for the next target, because the ocean isn't a place it visits. It's a system it moves through, continuously, endlessly. And every pass across the surface was another chance to take something out of it. It looks effortless from the outside, like it could stay up there forever. But it can't. Not without a cost. Because the moment it leaves the ground, the clock starts ticking. Every second in the air burns energy. Every mile demands oxygen. And for something this large, there's no margin for error. Miss a few hunts, lose the wind, get trapped in still air, and the system begins to fail. Slowly at first, then all at once. Out here, there's no safe place to land, no surface to rest on, just open water, stretching for miles. So Pteranodon doesn't wait for the problem, it's built to stay ahead of it. Inside its body, air doesn't move in and out like it does in most animals. It flows, continuously, one direction, always moving. Even as it exhales, it's still pulling oxygen. That means no wasted breath, no pause, no drop in supply, because up here, Even a moment of inefficiency matters. Its lungs aren't working alone. Air moves through a network of internal sacs, spreading through the body, into the bones, through the chest, carrying oxygen deeper, and heat away from where it can do damage. Because heat is another enemy. Hours in the sun, no shade, no shelter. The body begins to cook from the inside, but the airflow keeps it stable, cooling, regulating, keeping the system from tipping over. So while other animals are forced down to rest, to recover, to survive, Pteranodon stays up. Not because it's stronger, but because it lasts longer, and that's what decides everything. Not speed, not power, endurance. Because in a sky where food is scattered and unpredictable, the one that stays airborne the longest is the one that keeps eating, and the one that stops doesn't get a second chance. It's one thing to understand the mechanics. It's another to confront the scale. Because Pteranodon doesn't just fit into the modern sky, it redefines it. At nearly 20 feet across, its wingspan exceeds that of the largest eagles by more than double. Even the California condor, North America's largest flying bird, spans only about 10 feet. Next to Pteranodon, it becomes small. But wingspan alone doesn't capture the full impact. The body is lightweight, yes, around 50 pounds, but stretched across a frame that occupies a volume no modern flying animal approaches. When it passes overhead, it doesn't just cast a shadow. It erases light, and then there's altitude. With access to strong thermals, Pteranodon could climb thousands of feet into the air, high enough to become a silhouette barely visible in scanning a landscape that stretches for miles in every direction. From that height, coastlines become maps, schools of fish become patterns, and movement, any movement, stands out. It's not just a predator, it's an observer operating on a scale most animals never reach. Now place that into the modern United States. Busy shorelines, fishing boats, cargo ships, recreational aircraft, cities that never stop moving. Into that environment, introduce an animal that can travel dozens of miles without landing, that sees from above, that feeds without stopping. It doesn't collide with the system, it moves over it, and that creates a new layer in the ecosystem, one that didn't exist before. Because nothing alive today is built to compete in that exact space. And when a new space opens, something always fills it. At first, it feels like Pteranodon is entering an empty sky, a missing piece, finally returning. A large aerial hunter feeding on fish, gliding over open water, filling a role that looks untouched. But that assumption doesn't last, because that space, it isn't empty. It never was. It's already crowded. Pelicans, gulls, terns, ospreys, hundreds of thousands of birds, all pulling from the same moving resource, fish near the surface. And more than that, boats, nets, drones, entire industries built around the same target. From a distance, it looks like balance, but it's not. It's a system stretched right to its limit. And then something bigger enters it. Not slightly bigger, not comparable, something operating on an entirely different scale. Pteranodon doesn't hunt like the others. It doesn't dive, then rest. It doesn't fail, then reset. It doesn't stay in one place long enough to run out of food. It moves constantly. Miles of coastline in a single flight. One feeding ground, then another, then another. No pauses, no territory, no boundaries. And that's the moment everything changes, because now the competition isn't local anymore. It's everywhere. A single Pteranodon doesn't need to outfight anything. It doesn't need to chase birds away. It doesn't even need to be seen. It just needs to arrive first and leave before anything else realizes what's missing. At first, nothing looks different. The sky still has birds. The water still has fish. Boats still go out every morning. But underneath that, something is shifting. Quietly. The fish don't gather the same way. The timing feels off. The easy catches aren't easy anymore. And no one knows why. Because there's no fight, no visible takeover, no moment you can point to and say, that's when it started. Just a slow, spreading pressure from above. And that's the twist. Pteranodon doesn't need to dominate the ecosystem to take control of it. It just needs to exist at a scale nothing else was built to handle. The changes begin at the surface. Fish that once moved predictably along coastlines start to shift, driven not by temperature or currents, but by pressure from above. A predator that can cover miles in a single flight doesn't just hunt a school, it fragments it. Smaller groups break off. Movement becomes erratic, feeding windows narrow. For species that rely on timing, like seabirds that dive when fish rise close to the surface, this disruption matters. Miss the moment and the opportunity is gone. Pelicans return from long flights with less. Terns circle longer before committing to a dive. Ospreys hesitate, burning energy for a hunt that may not succeed. Nothing collapses immediately, but the margins tighten. And it doesn't stop with birds. Commercial fishing operations begin to notice subtle inconsistencies. Nets that once came up full now return, uneven. Not empty, but unpredictable. Schools that should be dense are scattered. At first, it's attributed to changing currents, warmer water, seasonal variation. But the pattern doesn't follow known models, because it isn't driven by the ocean alone, it's being shaped from the air. Over time, predators that depend on stable feeding grounds are forced to move farther, hunt longer, or compete more aggressively. Some adapt, others fall behind. And Pteranodon? It doesn't anchor itself to any one location. It doesn't defend territory in the traditional sense. It flows, appearing where conditions are optimal, leaving when they're not. That makes it difficult to predict, difficult to manage, and nearly impossible to exclude because the ecosystem isn't breaking. It's bending, quietly adjusting around a presence that was never part of the equation until now. The first real problem doesn't happen on the water, it happens in the air. At 2,000 feet just off the Gulf Coast, a small single-engine aircraft is moving along its usual route. Clear sky, stable conditions, nothing unusual. Until something crosses in front of the cockpit. Too fast to process, too large to ignore. For a split second, the pilot thinks it's another aircraft. Then the shape registers. Wrong wings, wrong movement, no engine, no sound. Just a shadow cutting across the glass. He jerks the controls, the plane dips hard to the left. Alarms flicker, the horizon tilts, and for a moment, he loses it. Not the aircraft, the thing outside, it's already gone. No collision, no impact, just empty sky again, but the space it passed through was real. And it was close, too close. Back on the ground, the report doesn't make sense. Large, unidentified flying animal. Wingspan exceeding known species. Non-flapping glide. It gets flagged, reviewed, filed. Not as a confirmed threat, but not dismissed either. Because there's already something else. Fishermen have been talking. Lower catches. Strange shadows over open water. Things moving where nothing should be moving. Individually, none of it means much. Together, it starts to form a pattern. And now, there's airspace involved. That changes everything. Because this isn't just wildlife anymore. It's an object moving through controlled flight zones without transponders, without predictable paths, without rules. And that's where the real problem begins. Not with attacks, not with direct conflict, but with uncertainty. Pilots start adjusting routes. Some avoid certain coastal stretches entirely. Reports increase, most unconfirmed, some consistent, always the same details, silent, large, gliding, and never where it's expected to be. There's still no official statement, no classification, no protocol. Because nothing in the system was built to handle this. Not something that doesn't land, not something that doesn't stay. Not something that appears and disappears before you even realize it was there. But one thing is already clear. It doesn't need to hit anything to become a problem. It just needs to be close enough. There won't be a moment when the world stops and realizes what's happening. No breaking news. No clear beginning. Just small things. Easy to ignore. A pilot changing course. A fishing route that no longer works. A shadow that shows up where nothing should be. At first it feels like coincidence. Then it happens again and again. Until it stops being a question and becomes a pattern. Because that's how something like this enters a system. Not all at once, but quietly, gradually, until it's already part of it. And that's the uncomfortable truth. Nothing about the modern world actually prevents it from surviving. The air still moves, the oceans still feed it, the sky is still open. In some ways, we've made it easier. More heat rising from cities. More consistent wind patterns. More space than anything else can fully occupy. It doesn't feel like something returning. It feels like something that fits. And that raises a question we're not used to asking. Not whether Pteranodon could live here, but whether it was ever the wrong world for it in the first place. Because extinction doesn't always mean failure. Sometimes it just means timing. And if that timing changes, then the next time you look up at an empty sky, you might want to ask yourself one thing: is it actually empty? Or are you just not seeing what's already there?